Well, most of uh, I'm liking this tape for the benefit of my family, and so the local people know this. But I will say that the piano that grandmother had down here in Florida was recently given by Dickey Coleman to the museum on Sanibel. That reminds me that grandfather bought the grand piano at the World's Fair, I think 1905, for Grandmother Dickey. And that was in our home in Bristol.
Oh, that must have been some chore getting that down here.
No, that was never down here.
Oh,
that was in Bristol.
Oh, that was the one there.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
But she was enough of artist that, she wanted that piano, and he got it for her.
Do you remember anything of Ding Darling? Was he?
Well, I'd like to mention that.
All right.
I married J.C. Peterson from Iowa and moved from Virginia out there in 1931. In the years between there and about, I'd say 35 or 6, I don't remember exactly, I always read Ding Darling's column in the Des Moines Register. It was very newsy and interesting. All of a sudden one fall, he began to tell about starting out in his trailer, which was kind of new transportation in those days, for some place where it was warm. And I read for like a month while he was traveling of where he was. Well, where does he end up? He's on Captiva.
Oh, how interesting. But he wasn't here when you were?
No.
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 Well, he was a pretty famous guy down here.
Yes. And I've always been very interested in him because I knew him, see, from my beginning in Iowa.
Of course.
And his interest in conservation and so forth.
I do remember that his cartoons were in our Buffalo newspaper. I remember that signature, Ding.
Uh-huh.
And don't remember any particular ones, but I remember almost every night there was another cartoon by Ding.
Uh-huh. Well, I knew he was in other papers, but I didn't know which ones.
He was very widely syndicated, I guess. So have you visited?
Don't you think I've run out of steam?
I think so. Now, where are you living now?
Well, I might mention about that.
Yeah.
In 1936, Pete and I came down on a trip. Came across on the ferry, which of course I'd never seen before, and stayed with Herman and Evelyn. We were here for 2 or 3 days, and the first night we were here, Herman and Carl said they thought Pete should go tarpon fishing, and that it was the right time of the month or something, that moon was shining or something that should make it good fishing. So they got in touch with Captain Strand, and I remember Carl was in the boat with us, and we fished the bayous down on Sanibel. Pete got a strike. I was sitting near the stern of the boat. We had 2 swivel chairs. So they told me to get out of that chair and let Pete get into mine that was closer to the stern. Well, he, of course, with lots of instruction on how to keep your line taut and all that, he finally brought it in all right. And they tied it to the bow of the boat as we came home, hoping a shark wouldn't get a hold of it. And after we got back to the house, they hung it up in a tree and put a tarp over it and had a colored man pour water on it during the night to keep it from spoiling, because Pete wanted to have it mounted.
Oh, this was a tarpon? Oh.
65-pound tarpon.
Oh, my.
The next day, Pete caught another one, a smaller one, in Captiva Pass. And
Herman was an excellent fisherman and a fishing guide.
I don't know why they needed a guide when they had those two, Carl and Herman, available.
They knew everything. My father said Herman taught him everything he knew about fishing.
Yes. Well, Herman spent a lot of time down here and did some building and things like that. He studied architecture when he was in college.
Oh, did he? I didn't know what he had done down here, whether he just came winters or...
Well, he might have had a heart murmur or something. I know that he had some physical reason for grandfather approving of him
Being
living
down here
kind
all
of a
winter.
simple life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He there's one large house down here that he was the architect for, but I don't recall the name of the family.
Oh.
Down towards the south part of the island.
But now where are you living? In?
Well, I live down here. You mean?
Do you live in Fort Myers now?
Well, in 30 when we came down in 36, I was beginning to think about when we would retire. That was a long ways off.
Mm-hmm.
But Pete knew there was no golf over here at the time, and so I told him, since most Iowa people go to Arizona or California or did at that time, that I wanted him to get familiar with Florida in case we wanted to come back down here. So in in the 50s, we visited a number of times locally and on the East Coast. And in 1962, we bought property at Fort Myers Beach.
Oh, I see.
Bought and built a house and lived there until 78. And now we live adjoining a golf course in South Fort Myers.
Oh, I don't think I have your address. So I can send you this tape.
Want to sit up closer?
Mr. Peterson, tell me how you happened to come down here and why you're living in... What did you do most of your life?
Well, Alma and I were married in 31, and times were very tough, and actually we were suffering. But we started a new company, and we're doing quite well. So this particular year, in 36, I was driving a new Packard, a dark green car, and we had to go to Virginia and Texas. So we decided we could stop by Captiva. So we did, and I remember parking my car right near Herman's place, and first thing he told me, he says, "Move your car." He says, "a coconut might drop on that beautiful car." Well, that evening, he and Carl got together, and they started talking, and they said, "We ought to take Pete and Alma out to fish for tarpon."
Now this we do have. Okay, go ahead.
So we'll call Captain Strand. So they did, and he came up with the boat, and he and Alma and I went out with a full moon, phosphorus on the water, and we hadn't been out about 9 o'clock, I guess. We hadn't been out over a half an hour, and I had a big strike on, a big tarpon standing on his tail trying to shake the hook. And we brought that fish in, and they hung it on a tree and put a tarp on it and watered it all night because of the saying that a fish will spoil faster in the moonlight than in the sunlight. And which they did. We had that fish mounted, and it hung over our fireplace in our summer home for some 40 years. And that was my experience mainly down here.
Do you still have it?
We crossed on the ferry, and as I remember, I paid $1.50.
I think that was it.
Because on the ferry with a car.
Mm-hmm. That was interesting. Well, so at least you're in this part of Florida for keeps now.
Well, maybe she told you that we had quite often mentioned that most of my friends in northwest Iowa and that part of the country go to California and Arizona for the winter. But Alma said, not me, that we're going to Captiva. And we didn't come here because she said, thinking of me, I guess, she said, we'll buy property on Estero Island because then you can get to play golf, which is the way it worked.
Well, good, and I hope you've had a real happy retirement.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That's good. Well, thank you. Oh,
I just celebrated my 85th birthday, and Alma's 80, you see.
How long have you been married?
53 years. Yeah, it's been
Yeah.
a long time.
We celebrated our 50th last
54.
summer. We celebrated our 50th
Oh, did
last
you?
summer. Got a picture there of all of our family at the party.
Now, what did your husband do?
Well, we don't have to put all of this in. This is Kay Schultz on May 9th, 1985, interviewing Mrs. Alma Peterson, Mrs. J.C. Mrs. Peterson is the granddaughter of Dr. Dickey. Dr. Dickey's had 3 children by his first wife, who died quite young. Then he married Julia, the second Mrs. Dickey. She raised those 4 children and 3 of her own. Alma Peterson's mother was the oldest of the 4 of the first brood. And when her parents died in 1907, she and her brother came to live with Dr. Dickey and Julia Dickey, his second wife. They lived in Bristol in the summertime and on Captiva in the winter. And it's of these early days between 1911 and 1918 that Mrs. Patterson is going to be speaking.
He married the second time. And one story that I'd like for my family to know is that she considered herself the mother of these 3 younger children. And reportedly, she one time locked Grandmother Dickey in a closet until Grandfather came home because she didn't think she was handling the younger children right. Herman, Carl, and Ernest, by the second wife, Julia, were small children. I would say they were high school age when brother and I came to live with Grandfather in Bristol and at Captiva in the winters. I wish I didn't ask.
Go ahead.
We would leave Bristol in November by train, and it was quite a group of us, including Grandfather and his wife, their 3 boys, and my brother and I, with a colored man and wife who became cook and gardener when we got down. We would arrive at the train station at least an hour or more before train time because we had a very scurrying time getting everybody loaded and ready. I was usually in charge of carrying either an umbrella or a camera, and whichever it was, I usually lost en route. I remember coming through northern part of Florida and looking out and thinking there was snow on the ground because in the moonlight, that's what the sand looked like. We came either to Punta Gorda or Fort Myers on alternate years. At Punta Gorda, we would arrive around 4 o'clock in the morning by train and be backed out on a pier, and then get on the boat around 7:30 and arrive at Captiva around noon, as I recall. At Fort Myers, we would arrive about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, spend the night at a hotel, and I remember always liking the hotel, which I think was the Royal Palm. Then the next morning early, we would get on and come out on the mailboat. When on the island, it was a big time of the day when the mailboat arrived around noon. We used to have a path that went from our house near the bay down to the post office. And I remember running along that path and seeing a black snake cross the path, which frightened me very badly. Other than that, other than seeing a few black snakes, I never saw any snakes down here. I do recall one time that Carl, who was rather a prankster, the grandfather Dickey's second family were Herman, Carl, and Ernest. And Carl one day had put a black snake that he had killed by snapping it like a whip right in front of the step coming out of the front of the house. And then he called me to come out. Well, of course, I screamed and yelled, and I think laid it on a little heavy. Grandfather took him back to the house and gave him a whipping.
Was he quite a stern disciplinarian?
Well, I always thought so. Although he himself had a lot of humor that I'd like to tell you about. Maybe I can tell that right now.
All right.
He fished a great deal, and really he came down here because he was said he had catarrh, he called it, which we call sinus trouble, I guess. He loved to fish, and one day he brought in a shark to have the cook prepare. And at that time we had a governess who loved fish also to eat. He kept it a secret that he had brought in this shark. Miss Fitzpatrick always asked for the brownest piece of fish on the platter. And so when he started to serve her, he purposely started to give her a paler looking piece of fish. He told the cook to prepare it that way. She pointed over and said, and I remember sitting at the table and this going on, not knowing, of course, that it was shark. She said, Dr. Dickey, I'd prefer to have that brown piece on this side. So he, without cracking a smile, just gave her the piece she asked for. Well, sometime after the meal was over, she learned that she had eaten shark. And at that time, no one thought of eating shark. And I think she maybe was sick.
Oh, dear. Did you like it? Did it taste good?
It tasted all right to me. Our favorite fish, and what he caught the most, would be sheephead, caught in the bay, usually near Blind Pass, and Spanish mackerel, caught off the dock in the Gulf. He put this dock in, I understand, 3 times. I remember 2 different ones.
This was a dock on the Gulf.
On the Gulf front. And it washed out the first year he put it in. I don't think that one was maybe a very long one or very well put in, maybe. But I do remember when he put one in that the pile drivers by barge had to come in the Gulf. And I do have a picture of it, which looks like a pretty substantial dock. In the daytime there, as kids, our entertainment was mostly swimming. We had a very wide beach of sawgrass and sea grape and native growth for, I would say, a block in front of the house, front being towards the Gulf. The house really faced south, but towards the Gulf. And then there would be almost equally wide beach and quite a few shells. The shelling was always better towards Blind Pass, and I don't think we ever walked very much going north.
Oh?
I'm thinking what to bring out next.
How about the garden?
Well, Grandmother I admired very much for her garden. Anymore, you'd never realize of the gardens that you can see from the road. Now, I don't know what some of these people have who live back in secluded places. But she had a garden that was approximately, well, I'd say almost a block square. The
Didn't you
aisle
say that it occupied the space between her house and Herman Dickey's house?
near Herman's.
Oh.
our dock was down in that area, and the things that she planted were always planted like specimen plants. There'd be a lot of hibiscus, a lot of oleanders, and all of them were surrounded by a circle of clamshells. And all of our paths were lined with clamshells.
It's a very formal type garden, really.
Well, compared with native stuff,
Mhm.
it would be.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few trees there besides cabbage palms that I'm sure they must have planted. I remember a rubber tree and something that I can't think of the name of it, but the bark is like an onion skin, very thin and peels.
Gumbo limbo?
That's it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There were no coconut palms. And one of the last years that I was there, I remember her having a colored man plant the coconut palms. Later on, when my husband and I visited, Herman Dickey reminded us not to park the car under the coconut palm,
Mm-hmm.
for which we were glad it was a new car.
Yeah, that can be deadly to a car.
We went to school to Miss Fitzpatrick in a two-story building right back of our house, which had a schoolroom and the colored couples room on the first floor, and 2 or 3 little dressing rooms for the swimmers. On the second floor, later, Grandmother Dickey's mother and sister lived. Our schooling would be in the morning. They were very strict about our hours on the schooling, and we had to, if we missed our spelling, I recall this in particular, we were not allowed to play with any playmates in the afternoon. So after missing our spelling for several days in a row, we sent word to Emily Snyder, who was the youngest of the 4 Snyder girls, the Snyder school people, that the next time the family took a picnic somewhere or traveled away in the boats, that we would all stay home and that we would go down on the beach and build a fire and have a roast, which was part of our fun. On this particular time, we walked south, and it was after a blow. We told Brother to start a fire on the beach and roast our potatoes, and we had also a can of pears with us, which we'd sneaked out of the pantry. Emily and I walked down the beach quite a ways, and finally we saw Brother just wildly waving and yelling for us to come back. And here was he had built the fire close to the sea oats, and they'd caught on fire.
Oh my.
On account of this wind that was still blowing.
Uh-huh.
We got back there, and Brother said, we saw right away it was out of our hands. And he had opened the can of pears and was carrying water from the Gulf to put it out. But Emily and I knew enough to try to throw sand on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we still saw we weren't making headway, so we sent him. We didn't want him to go after Ernest because afraid Ernest would tell on us. But we sent him for the Jagger boy, who was a teenager. And he finally came with him, and together we got the fire out. Well, for a long time, there would be remarks around about that fire down on the beach, and of course we didn't admit or say a word. And I don't know whether the family ever knew or not how that was started, but it was a pretty good room-size patch of fire that could have spread more, you know.
You never were disciplined for this. They just,
No,
nobody
we never
really knew
admitted
what happened.
anything. And as far as, now, I will say that Grandfather, in some ways, was pretty clever, the way he handled things.
Mm-hmm.
I never knew whether he might have been suspicious of what had happened, because I can remember being on the, Brother and I having sneaked something else out of the pantry and be down on the beach somewhere near the dock eating it. And Grandfather would come down to go fishing, and we'd covered up with sand, and he'd walk by on the dock and look down at us, and he'd say, "Covered up, covered up, covered up."
He wanted you to have your fun.
I think so.
Yeah.
He knew that everything wasn't perfect for us, you know. Now, I will say in Grandmother Dickey's behalf, she raised his first 4 children, 3 of her own, and then had brother and I come and live with her. And she didn't have it so easy either.
I think that was quite a handful for her. I hadn't realized that she had raised all the first family, too.
Yes.
Plus his grandchildren. Well, she must have been quite a gal.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was a wonderful seamstress, did beautiful crocheting. Down in Florida, I don't think we had anything, but in our home in Bristol, she had work that I've never seen anything like it until fairly recent years, and usually something that would come from a foreign country, you know. She crocheted with sewing cotton. Now, so you know how fine the designs would be in detail. And what she made was, that I particularly recall, were curtains with inserts like a foot square, and it might be a tree, or it might be, you know,
embroidered
things.
in?
No, not embroidered, crocheting.
Crocheting. Oh.
With that fine yarn or fine thread. Now, it may not have been spool thread, but it was what I considered that size.
I wonder if
to
any
be.
of those are still in existence.
I imagine Dorothy Dickey has some of them.
Could be. I must ask her. Tell me about the picnics you said you used to go on.
Well, the families that I recall being there, and then there certainly must have been some others, would be the Snyders. Then going south on the island would be our place. Then Dr. Hicks from Bristol. Dr. Hicks' daughter, Miss Trula, lived there, and maybe you've heard about Miss Trula.
Yes.
I want to tell you something else about that.
All right.
Beyond that, the families I either don't remember very well or something, but the Jagger house was there, and that's still out here. I think I recognize it when I go by. But anyway, there would be, like 4, 6, or 8 boats of us. Would go different places. One place that we went quite often would be the south end of Costa, because there was no blind pass. I mean, no redfish pass. And then we also went to Mount Key a lot. We would go to the Bailey store, often for if we ran out of sugar or flour or some staple like that. One time that I recall particularly, I think we went more than that, but we had a picnic on Edison's Pier, and walked through his garden with him. And I think that's where Grandmother got the idea of, or he suggested to her, that she try the Australian pine out here.
You said he gave her the seedlings to plant?
That's what I understood. I think that happened, though, after 1918, because I don't recall that being planted, but I do remember the coconuts.
That's interesting. Those Australian pines are half blessing, half curse
yes,
today.
They are. We know that now. I remember him as a very short man, very white-haired, and interesting. I remember following him around. I guess I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't thought he was explaining a lot of the plants he had and things like that.
You'd go there by boat? That must have taken a long...
Well, it would be an all-day trip, you know.
Even today, from here to
it's a little
downtown,
almost an all-day trip.
Would be an all-day trip.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I don't recall that anybody ever left the island. Dr. Hicks, of course, was retired, but he gave us advice on physical things, except that somebody one time had to go in to go to the dentist. And when Roosevelt was out here, when he left...
Were you ever here when Theodore Roosevelt visited?
Yeah, I'll tell you about that, too.
Yes, do.
One day, before I saw it, my brother noticed that there was a houseboat that looked like a barge with a more or less like a log cabin type of boat house on it. parked out in the bay, very close to our bay dock. And the island, of course, you people who live here realize the narrowness of the island, and that's why Grandfather picked out the location he did.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted both a bay and access to the Gulf. Brother evidently rode out and must have found out that it was Teddy Roosevelt, because I remember being on the porch with Grandfather, and Grandfather sitting in his rocking chair, and Henry came back and reported that Teddy Roosevelt was out there.
Was he president then?
No, that was
No.
after, you see.
I see.
Grandfather was a great admirer of him, and I think if he hadn't known that he was coming to that area, he did make a point to get acquainted with him, and we have pictures, a picture at least, that was taken on our...
Taken together. Did they
on-
become firm
on-
friends after that, and he repeated the visit, or
Not that
was
I
it
know
a
of, I'm
one-time
not sure
thing?
of.
You don't know, yeah.
But then I was there, of course, when he fished for the devilfish in the Gulf. And I assume Blindfish Pass was open to small boats. And he was fishing from a so-called launch that was fairly long. I would say it might have been 18 or 20 feet, maybe even 22 or 4 feet. He and Colonel Cole and guides were out in the Gulf, and we seemed to know that they were after a devilfish. We'd never seen one, but we knew it was a ray type of fish. And after they, I don't know how far out they might have been when they speared it, because they had more than one harpoon in it, I think. They moved back and forth in front of the island for, I would say a distance of 6 or 8 blocks for a long time, and finally wore it out enough that they came in closer to shore, and then with some of these ropes that were harpooned into the devilfish, everybody who was currently around came out on the beach to pull it in. And I would say that there might have been 30 or 40 people there. I mean, it seems to me like, now I might have an exaggerated
It was quite an
idea
event.
of how many people were there, because the picture that we have was taken after it was on shore and been examined and turned over, and
What did they ever do with it? What can you do with it?
they just pulled it back out, I think.
Oh, towed it out and
Uh-huh.
let it go.
And now, from things I've read, I've understood one reason he was interested in finding the devilfish would be to try to find another source of cod liver oil,
Oh,
and for the leather of the hide. A picture that we have shows Grandfather Dickey and Ernest, and I think Herman and my brother, together with 12 or 15 other people after it was pulled up. And during that time, I recall that somebody came out and wanted to take Roosevelt's picture, and he lifted me up and held me. And of course, I wasn't smart enough to know that I wanted a copy of that picture.
Oh.
And I didn't know who took it either.
isn't that too
So
bad?
I've always regretted that.
Yeah.
It was turned off.
You were saying that there were fishermen used to stop by once in a while. You want to tell that story?
Well, the thing I remember about that, there were large sailboats, either the same or a little bit larger than a shrimp boat, with quite a few sails. And they would show up quite far out in the Gulf.
Didn't you
maybe-
have a certain name for that kind of
We
boat?
called it a Cuban smack.
A smack. Mhm.
And I don't know if that's the correct name for
I
it. or
bet
not.
it is.
Mhm.
Sounds good to me.
Well, when they would show up like a mile offshore, it seemed a mile to me anyway. They'd put a rowboat over, and it was usually a very long, narrow rowboat with about 6 men rowing it. And they'd come ashore, and the thing that they were anxious to get, and I know that for several years they would, and maybe once or twice a winter they'd do that, they'd come and ask for vegetables. And we had a nice vegetable garden, so we would give them what we could spare. In exchange, they wanted to give us cigars and either guava jelly or guava paste. Well, Grandfather didn't like their cigars, although he was a great cigar smoker. But the thing that I liked the most would be the guava jelly. And you don't even see that on the market much anymore.
Hardly ever see it anymore.
It was very much like a gumdrop, and came in a package kind of like a package of 2 by 2 by 8 cheese.
Oh, square and firm.
And we'd cut it. It would be just like a gumdrop when we'd eat it.
What fun.
Mm-hmm.
Now, were these Cubans from Cuba, or do you think they were out of Tampa, perhaps?
No, I think they were from Cuba.
Right from Cuba.
But that's what I thought at the time.
That's very interesting. They didn't try to sell you fish in exchange for your vegetables.
No,
but they were
and I'm not
fishing.
sure what they were fishing for or how they handled their fish when they got them. But primarily that must have been it, because it may have even been the same ones that came year after year.
Mm-hmm.
Because Grandfather was very friendly with them, and we always kind of, the kids anyway, enjoyed having them come.
Well, someone else said that these Cuban fishermen would come and almost set up a camp. They'd pitch tents, and they'd salt their fish down and wait until they had the boat loaded before they'd go back to Cuba.
That must be how they kept them, but although I don't recall them knowing that they did that.
Mm-hmm. That's what I had heard.
Yes. Well,
You did a lot of fishing yourself, didn't you?
well, I'd often fish with Grandfather. Brother and I both would, and one of these other boys. We fished largely in the pass between Buck Key and the island that became Roosevelt Pass.
Mm-hmm.
And or at the end of the island. Of course, there was no bridge at Blind Pass, but I showed my husband today the area where we would usually stop the boat. I don't think Grandfather particularly liked to take me because I was too talkative, and he was very quiet and wanted you to be when you fished.
My father used to say you had to think fish all the time, and he wouldn't let my mother even take a magazine along when she got bored. She was supposed to fish or think fish all the time.
All the time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he fished off of the Gulf dock mostly for Spanish mackerel, and those two were our favorites.
You have said that Dr. Dickey had a boat, a launch. How big was that?
Well, the boat that we called a launch was a runabout boat, no top to it, and inboard motor. I would say maybe 20 feet. I can't even say for sure. The picture of the one that Roosevelt fished from out in the Gulf looks like a longer one to me than the ones that we had and the neighbors had.
But how many could get into this boat comfortably?
Well, 5 or 6 people, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But he did have a larger one that we used usually on excursions like. It was a pointed bow and a pointed stern, and with a top and a little narrow awning around the top. It was pretty, and as nice as anything that we were seeing at that time down here.
Did it have quite a large motor?
It must have had, although I don't.
Because more
recall.
people would go in that, you
Yes,
said.
we could take, I'd say 15 or so in there. It had even a small head.
Mm-hmm. Would you use these boats to get your supplies, maybe at Bailey's, or did you count on the mailboat to bring everything?
Well, we counted on the mailboat almost entirely. It would be only if we ran out of something. And then seems like I can remember both the larger boat and the small boats occasionally going to Bailey's.
Mm-hmm. That was still a long trip to make if you had to go there for anything.
Uh-huh. Of course, I was always glad to go along because we could buy candy.
Oh, whereas you couldn't just say to the mailboat captain, bring me a
Bring
couple
me
of
some
candy
candy.
bars.
I don't recall that we ever particularly had the captain bring us anything out like I've heard other people did,
Mhm.
and maybe like they did in later years.
But how about milk? What did you do for milk?
We just had canned milk.
Oh,
And in the fall, the grandfather had cases of things like peas and corn and supplies of flour and sugar and things like that shipped from Tampa,
oh, I see.
and it would arrive, of course, with the mailboat. I remember one year some of our supplies were late getting there, and we joked that all we had would be grits and fish, and then the next meal we'd have fish and grits.
That's cute. Did you have must have taken a lot of storage area if you sent for enough things to last you the winter?
Well, the house was larger then than it is now.
Oh,
The front of the house is the same, and it had the living room, and what we called the inside dining room, which was never used unless we had a blow.
mm-hmm.
And then we had the library, which we had our school in. And
Was that attached to it?
that's what the first floor of the house was.
I see.
And back of that, there was an outdoor porch with awning on the one side. Not a porch exactly, but a room with one exposure, with screen and awning. Then there was a pantry and kitchen, which I don't think is there anymore. You see, it was a pretty large family with
Right.
3 boys
Mhm.
of their own, and my brother and I, and Miss Fitzpatrick lived with us.
Right. Was Herman still living at home at the time, or was he?
He was in college
Oh.
most of that time, not
Mhm.
all of it. But I don't think he ever went to school to Miss Fitzpatrick.
I see. The only one
Carl
of the
did a
boys,
little, but Ernest in particular.
Ernest, was with you in school there.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Then the upper floor, you see, had 5 bedrooms and a trunk room, we call it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's still there. Still there. That must have been quite a project, just getting that built. How long a season would you stay? What time of year would you come, and when would you leave?
Well, we would come in November and leave in the latter part of May.
Tell me about Christmases.
Well, that's kind of funny. I don't remember. Grandmother always had a Christmas tree. That was often in this inside dining room, and that room was usually locked
Mm-hmm.
most of the year. I don't remember too much about what our Christmas gifts were, except that she made a baby doll for me when I didn't appreciate it that much because I thought I'd outgrown baby dolls. But it was a doll with a beautiful wardrobe, all handmade garments, and
That was a labor of love.
yes, it really was.
Did you keep it? Not necessarily.
Well, a few years ago in Iowa, I still had the baby head, and a woman came when we had a garage sale there when we were moving. I brought out a great big doll that was a carnival thing
Mm-hmm.
that one of our boys had won, and put it out there, and she bought that in a hurry. And she said, "Do you have any more dolls?" And I said, "Well, the only thing I've got is a baby doll head." And she said, "Well, I'd like to see it." So I sent my son in to look for it. I knew where to tell him to try to find it. And when he brought it out, she said, "How much do you want for it?" And I said, "Well, I have no idea what it's worth or anything about it." I said, "You make me an offer." And she paid me 3 or 4 times what I thought I would have asked.
Oh, my.
hmm
I had a baby doll when I was little with red pony skin hair, and it had a china face and eyes that opened and closed with lashes. I think it was a German-made doll.
Yeah.
And I loved that baby Helene. Took such good care of it. And I knew enough to save this for my daughter.
Oh.
So one day when my daughter was homesick with the measles or something, I brought this out, let her play with it, and she dropped it on the bathroom floor.
Oh, boy.
And there it went. And she says to me, will say to me now, Mother, it's a wonder you didn't kill me. But she says, you were so nice about it, you just, well, it was an old doll anyway. But it nearly broke my heart.
Uh-huh.
So those dolls are more valuable
Yes.
than you would guess. I guess people,
I
they're
think,
collectibles today.
yes, I'm sure that head was.
Yeah.
I'd like to tell you something that I think happened after I was not on the island anymore, but my brother was still there. Miss Trula Hicks, that I always thought of as being a typical spinster. She and some friend went down on the beach early one morning and were swimming in the nude. I didn't know it was done in those days. But grandfather, with his binoculars, saw this. And he told my brother to go out on the beach and walk up and down the beach so they wouldn't come out until he got his fishing tackle together. And he went out on the dock and fished like, I think, a couple of hours and kept those girls in the water all that time.
Isn't that funny? That was very risque, I suppose.
Yes.
But she did marry, didn't she? She wasn't an old maid, didn't she
Well,
marry?
I think she married after I left there
Oh.
because she did marry, and I don't recall anything about it.
I know her name, they say, is Trula Hicks Rouse.
That was it.
All right.
Yes, and that was a man from Bristol, I think.
But she must have been quite a gal.
Well, she wasn't what I would call quite a gal.
Oh.
Compared with today. But maybe in those
A little
years
daring,
she was.
a little daring.
Because that's the only risque thing I ever knew about her.
I remember my mother saying about Alice Roosevelt Longworth that when she was seen riding in the park in Washington, two young ladies riding not side saddle, but cross saddle, and they were sure that one, if not both of them, were Alice Roosevelt. And I thought maybe this was the kind of person that Miss Trula was, too.
Well, she was a jolly person, but I never thought of her as, being any form of risque.
Yeah, not extroverted at all.
No. The Snyder School, have I put this in here before?
I don't remember.
The Snyder School was a building that I understand Grandfather Dickey primarily, and Dr. Hicks maybe with him, built to entertain, so that there'd be a place to send their friends when they came down, because they'd been kind of overrun in their own homes. And it was called the Eber House because Miss or Mrs. Eber ran it.
They were, I believe, somebody else told that story, a German family that had been originally on Buck Key.
I think
and came
so.
over here to run that.
The Snyder girls were all friends of mine, and the two younger ones particularly. And Sylvia Kress, that I remember in your book was mentioned by someone, she was a good friend of mine.
Oh.
She came down with a governess, and now a companion maybe I should say, but I think she also taught her. She would have a few things to eat that I always enjoyed when I was over there. This woman encouraged me to come a lot because Sylvia didn't have any other playmates. I think she was down here for her health. And one thing that I recall that she had was ground figs and malted milk mixed together. And I've wished many times I could get a hold of it because I was so crazy about it then. And I've thought about doing it, and when I've gone to the store and asked for malted milk, they either didn't have it or I forgot to ask.
I can remember as a little girl having malted milk stirred into hot milk.
Yes.
It made it very tasty.
Uh-huh.
It was supposed to be loaded with vitamin B or some such thing.
Calories too, probably.
Oh, I'm sure it was, but they thought it was very good for skinny little girls.
Uh-huh.
I understand that Mrs. Dickey was a well-trained pianist and had a piano down here. Did you hear her play very much?
Oh, yes. She had been head of the music department in a small college in our hometown of Bristol. And that's where grandfather met her. And she played a lot of usually classical type of music. Or the thing that I recall myself about it was that in Bristol I took a few piano lessons. And when I was supposed to practice, which I didn't like doing anyway, she would be upstairs and call down to me that should have been D flat or F sharp or something of that order.
Oh, her ear was that good.
Uh-huh.
Hmm.
But
Did she ever give you lessons herself?
no, I don't think that would have worked very well.
But she did insist you practice.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
She played, it seemed to me like it went in streaks. Sometimes she'd just play like an hour or so, and there'd be other times somebody was around, and she usually had to be kind of encouraged if she played for other people.
I imagine she had her hands rather full.
Well, she did, and then I think possibly she had some arthritis or something in her fingers and felt that she didn't play as well as she wanted to play.
Was Dr. Dickey retired at this time completely, or was he, when he was in Bristol, was he still running the business?
Well, mostly he was retired. He had a small dairy outside of town, and he used to ride horseback out to it, just because he liked to ride a horse, I think. And then he also carried on for a long time, and for many years after he died, he had a small business of an eye water. It is not on the market anymore, but at the time that he first came to Florida, I think he heard about this area because he sold it a great deal in Texas because of the sand blowing.
Oh, I see.
And he traveled by train to Texas. And as I understood, on one of those trips, he got the idea of coming down here.
Oh,
I don't think it was ever a popular item in the Florida area.
I see. But what were these sold around in drugstores, or was it all
Yeah.
mail order?
Well, it was both.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, a lot of it was mail order.
And this was manufactured in Bristol.
In
Did
Bristol.
he have a little factory or a...
No, it was just part of the building that his office was in.
I see.
He had 2-3 employees.
Mm-hmm. What, didn't he have other businesses too there?
Well, he actually...
A hotel or something?
Well, there was a hotel, not a real large one, but in those days it was large, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I remember him telling stories about the panic, was it 1908? When he started first selling this eye water, he'd travel by buggy through the country and trade it for chickens or anything else they'd trade for.
Oh.
But he did I think, make some money by with real estate, because he always dabbled in that a little.
Mm-hmm.
He bought a good portion of the central part of Captiva, you see,
Mm-hmm.
when he first bought,
Came down
and
here.
sold to his friends like Dr. Hicks and the Price,
Mm-hmm.
who's now Twin Waters, you know.
Yeah.
And he had an area that was north of where the Snyder School is, of some 40 acres. And after his death, his son by the first marriage was the executor, and he sold that to someone who intended to put a golf course there. The crash of 28 took care of that,
Mm-hmm.
and they, I think he sold it for $110,000, which was something out of this world in those days.
You bet.
And I think the down payment and maybe one other payment. The down payment, as I recall it, was like $10,000, and possibly one other payment, and then my Uncle John just signed it over to the people. It was, you know,
They couldn't pay anymore
They
on
couldn't
it,
pay
so
anymore, and he was glad to get rid of it, I
he
guess.
didn't. Oh, isn't
Get
that
that
too
much out of it.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
Mhm.
Hmm. I suppose everybody was hard hit by that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You see, there was about a boom at that time in Florida, and then it
I
went
remember
down
my
too.
grandfather coming to Florida and buying lots and land around, and my mother was still disposing of some of this, up until just a few years ago.
Uh-huh. Well, I'm not real sure whether he owned on the bay at that time where the post office was. I mean, whether he ever owned that or not.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he might have owned pretty close to where Chadwick's place started, wherever that
I wouldn't be
starts.
surprised, and there was a Dickey Road just down here.
There. Mhm.
And I think Dorothy said he owned everything on what's now Andy Rossi Lane.
Mhm.
I think they called it Palm Avenue then.
Oh,
That he owned down to there, through all the land on there.
yeah.
Well, he was a very astute businessman. He probably could foresee that this would be more valuable as time
I
went on.
think he was far-seeing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I often think about if he'd lived,
When
quite a
did he
few-
die?
Well, he died in 1923 at about age 63.
Oh, is that all he was when he
Uh-huh.
died?
That's my recollection
Somehow I was
of it.
thinking, with this big family, he was quite a patriarch and had
Uh-huh.
lived on and on. Oh, that isn't, that was young.
Uh-huh.
Seems to me now.
Yes.
And so you kept coming until it was time for you to go away to boarding school.
Yes. And I think by that time Grandma Dickey deserved a little bit of rest.
I guess so, too. Well, that's interesting.
And you see, they were getting older, too.
That's right. And probably by this time, Herman was married and raising his own family
He
over
was
there?
living, I think, at Bristol about that time.
I see.
Then after Grandfather died and after Grandmother Dickey was quite ill, she died in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Herman and Evelyn, of course, lived in that house
Mm-hmm.
until, well, no, maybe I'm telling that wrong, because maybe they built what's now his house